We also need to understand what they need to know, and the what comes from the field of linguistics. There's also an important contribution from the field of neuroscience, and that really focuses more on how reading development changes the brain. And the neuroscience research is the part that has the least direct impact on what we do in the classroom, but it is important to know that some instruction actually does change brain activation patterns and even brain structures. But basically, the point we want to make through all of this, though, is that the science of reading really refers to that accumulated body of evidence. Often when we hear practitioners talk about the science of reading, what we hear is reference to a particular approach to reading instruction or a particular program or something like that. And it's not that at all. Simply, in this case, the science is the evidence. What do we know about reading development, about instruction in reading? And that's where we're focused on today. So some of the resources that are on that digital handout are a webinar that goes into a little bit more detail about the science of reading. And then one that really helps practitioners. It's geared for teachers, but any practitioner can benefit from this, really discerning how to tell whether a particular product is science-based or is it simply snake oil. So to get us started, I wanted to begin with the simple view of reading. And I know that we have a lot of people from different backgrounds on this particular call. So I wanted to start with just an explanation of this, because this is something that drives a lot of the conversation. If you're not familiar with the simple view of reading, it's a theory of reading development. That doesn't suggest that reading is a simple process, but it's a simple way of thinking about the process. And it can be summed up in one sentence, and that is that reading comprehension is the product of decoding and linguistic comprehension. That sentence is really important, the wording of that sentence, because it tells us several important things. One, that reading is an outcome. It's not the reading comprehension is the outcome, that's what we get when we have decoding and linguistic comprehension. But really important is the word product, because this theory can be depicted as a mathematical formula. That decoding times linguistic comprehension equals reading comprehension. And the point of that is that you have to have strong skills in word reading, and you have to have strong skills in understanding spoken language if you're going to get to the point of having strong reading comprehension. If either of those things is weak, reading comprehension will be weak. If they're both weak, reading comprehension will be even weaker. So because we know that if you multiply anything times 0, the answer is going to be 0. If you're missing decoding skills or if you're missing linguistic comprehension skills, it doesn't matter how strong you are on the other side of the equation, you're going to have no chance of really comprehending what you're reading. So in light of that, it's important to understand that what we're going to be talking about today is what's often referred to as foundational reading skills, and that is on the D side of the equation. So understanding how to read words and how to spell words and what goes into that. So the way that we think about this is what we call a road to fluent reading. And so we think about the idea that before children reach school age, they do have some development of spoken language and even of written language. In general, we think of children knowing something about sounds and the sounds of speech, and that they know something about letters. Most children come to school knowing at least the first letter of their first name, even if they don't know any other letters. But some kids know a lot of letters when they reach school. But the idea is once they reach kindergarten, and in some cases preschool, they're starting to learn about how letters and sounds work together. And that instruction is really important to help them understand the connection between the phonemes or the sounds and the graphemes, or the things that represent the written representation of those sounds. So we call those grapheme phoneme correspondences. And just for the sake of space on my little diagram, I'm going to abbreviate that as GPCs. So that stands for grapheme phoneme correspondences, the connection between the sounds and the letters. Now, when we're talking about effective instruction and foundational skills, one of the key elements here is getting kids to understand the correspondences between graphemes and phonemes but more importantly, getting them to be able to apply those connections. So as soon as children know a few grapheme phoneme correspondences, we want them to start reading words. So if you know that A can represent the sound A and T can represent the sound T, you can read and probably spell the word at. And we want kids to do that from the very beginning. There are a lot of programs out there that have kids learn all of the letters of the alphabet and at least one sound to go with each letter before they even start reading words. And we don't adhere to that approach at all. What we found to be much more effective is get kids reading words from the very beginning. If you can read at, then when you learn that S can represent, now you can read sat, and you can start learning more and more words. And as soon as you know a few words, you can start reading text, even if it's a simple sentence like Pat sat. Not a whole lot of depth of meaning in that particular sentence, but it does hold meaning. You could draw a picture that shows Pat sat. And so getting kids to read in connected text helps them understand the why behind all of this. Why am I looking at these squiggly lines on a piece of paper and trying to match them with some sounds from my speech? It's because I want to be able to read text and understand it. And so as soon as possible, we like to get kids into text. Now, over across this whole road in all of the different elements, what we want to develop is children's accuracy and their automaticity. Both are very important. Accuracy, of course, is just being able to get it right, whether it's the sounds, the letters, the GPCs, words, or text. Being able to recognize accurately these things, whereas automaticity is getting it accurate, but very quickly. So it's effortless. Okay, so automaticity is a really important goal through all of these foundational reading skill development. We think of automaticity as just the ability to do anything without conscious thought, right? So that effortlessness that comes once you've done something so many times, you don't have to think about it anymore. That learning and repetition and practice is what gets us to the point of automaticity. And really importantly, automaticity allows your attention to be focused elsewhere. So when we think about that in terms of something that we've learned, maybe you've learned how to drive a car and you had to initially really think hard about which of those pedals on the floor made the car go and which one made it stop. But now you don't think about that at all. You just automatically put your foot in the right place. If you learn to play an instrument, if you learn to play a sport, you probably learn little tiny skills to the point of automaticity. Learn to play the scales, learn to dribble the basketball. And then you incorporated that into the orchestration of more complex skills. Reading is no different. We learn really basic tools like dribbling a basketball or playing the scales on the piano. But in this case, it's learning the letters, the sounds, the grapheme phoneme correspondences, and reading words in order to be able to get us to automaticity with text. So when it comes to automaticity in reading, if we have a child who struggles to decode words, they have to put a lot of effort into that. And so that effort that they're putting into it takes up a lot of their cognitive load. Their working memory is all tied up in getting through the word, identifying what the word is. When that's the case, there's hardly any cognitive effort left to devote to understanding the text. When children become good at decoding through lots of practice to the point where decoding becomes automatic, at that point, they have a lot of cognitive effort left over to devote to understanding the text. So sometimes I will hear people say, oh, you're spending so much effort on developing decoding skills, you're not paying enough attention to meaning. And I have to help people understand that the reason that we're focused on helping kids be able to read and spell words with automaticity is so that they can devote their attention to understanding the text. So as we go through today, we're going to be talking about each of these different points along the road and a little bit about how to develop accuracy and automaticity in each of these. So beginning with sounds and letters. So these ideas are really important early skills, and you can start developing some awareness of this in pre-K or even before that. So beginning with sounds, when we're talking about sounds, we usually, in reading, we're usually referring to them as phonemes. And most educators refer to phonemes as the smallest unit of sound in spoken language. This definition is accurate, but it's also incomplete. A phoneme is the smallest unit of sound in spoken language, but it's also the physical act used to produce the sound, the articulatory gesture, the vocal gesture. So back in the 60s and 70s, when linguists and psychologists were first really studying the development of phonological awareness and how this connected with reading, all of those early papers would refer to a phoneme as an articulatory gesture or a vocal gesture. But somewhere in translation into education, those concepts kind of got lost, and we just started focusing on what we're hearing, not what our mouths are doing. But to become phonemically aware, you really need to be aware of both the sound that you're producing and the mouth movements that occurred to produce that sound. For kids who are struggling in phonemic awareness, attending to what their mouths are doing usually has a really strong impact on improving their capacity to attend to the sound itself. So we incorporate in our instruction a lot of work on thinking about what your mouth is doing while you're producing a sound. Another thing to think about, if you're familiar with the concept of phonemic awareness and its role in reading, it became really well known among educators in 2000 when the National Reading Panel report came out. But some of that also got lost in translation. So even back in 2000, the National Reading Panel report indicated that the idea behind teaching phonemic awareness is really to help kids read and spell words. And one of the things that they emphasized was this idea that using letters in phonemic awareness instruction is important. This is a really critical thing to understand because, again, somewhere along the way, it got lost in translation. And I hear teachers say things like, well, you can do phonemic awareness instruction in the dark. If you use letters, it's no longer phonemic awareness instruction, it's phonics instruction. When in reality, if you're teaching kids to read and spell words, you're teaching them to blend sounds and to segment sounds. That is phonemic awareness instruction. If you're using letters, it's more effective phonemic awareness instruction. Is it also phonics instruction? Yes, it is. But if you're blending and segmenting the phonemes, you're helping them develop their phonemic awareness as well. And it's more effective. The other thing that somehow got lost in translation was this idea that there is a developmental sequence that's typical, where children start to become aware of larger units of sounds like words and syllables and intrasyllabic units before they become aware of phonemes. That's the very typical progression. But somewhere along the way, it got interpreted as, because this is the typical progression, it needs to be the progression that happens, or kids won't be able to work with phonemes correctly. And that's simply not true. There is no need to develop the capacity to rhyme, for example, before you start working on phoneme blending and segmentation. So that's a very common misunderstanding of the research. And actually working on rhyming or syllable segmentation doesn't have an impact on word reading or spelling. Working on phonemic segmentation and blending does. So that's where we focus our efforts there. Another element of working with sounds is how we pronounce the sounds. So one of the things that I'm kind of a real stickler for in our teacher preparation programs is getting teachers to learn how to pronounce sounds in a way that's blendable. So if you're saying, for example, B is ba and G is ga, when you're reading the word big, what you're really going to be reading is ba-i-ga. And it doesn't matter how quickly you say those sounds, the best you're going to get is ba-i-ga. You're not going to get to the word big. So we spend a lot of time focused on how to make sounds blendable for children, saying them in a way that works. So instead of ba, I'm saying b. Instead of wa, I'm saying w, because those are sounds that are more blendable when I'm reading. When we get into letters, there's also a lot of different ways to know a letter. And I think that this is an important thing to understand, because I'll hear a teacher say, oh, he knows all of his letters. Well, like, really? What does he know about his letters, right? So one element that you need to know is the name of the letter. Can I show you this letter and ask you what letter is this? And you tell me that's an A. That's pretty straightforward. Can I give you an array of letters and say, point to the A. That's a different skill than what letter is this? So generating the name versus identifying it within an array of letters, those are different kinds of skills. They're both letter knowledge, but they're different. They're asking different things. We also need to know, for example, the sound of the letter. If I ask you what sound does this letter make, can you tell me that A represents A? Can you also tell me that it represents A or ah or There are a number of sounds that we associated with the letter A, and how much of that do you know? When we're talking about letter formation, do you know how to write the letter A? Do you know where to begin, which direction to move, and where to end up? That's all part of knowing the letters, knowing how to form the letter, and more specifically, how to form the letter correctly. There is an efficient stroke for each letter, and it's not always the most natural stroke for kids to use. Typically, children want to start from the baseline and move away. We want them to learn from the beginning the most efficient formation, because that makes a big difference in their later writing abilities. And then finally, that idea of letter naming automaticity. How quickly can you name individual letters? These are all different ways to know a letter. So as we move along the road, once you've learned some things about sounds and learned some things about letters, you want to immediately get into learning about grapheme phoneme correspondences. So as I mentioned earlier, the phonemes are those smallest unit of sounds and the physical act used to produce the sound. So in a word like sheep, we have the phonemes sh, e, p. So that's pretty straightforward. When we're talking about the graphemes in the word, we always have the same number of phonemes and graphemes, because a grapheme is the written representation of a phoneme. So in the word sheep, our first grapheme is SH, the next grapheme is EE, and the final grapheme is P. And when we're talking about the letters, that's very unpredictable. It's not a one-to-one correspondence. So the sh sound is represented by an S and an H. So the number of letters in a word has nothing to do with the number of the phonemes in a word. A grapheme can be 1 letter, 2 letters, 3 letters, or even 4 letters. But a phoneme grapheme connection is just the sound and the written representation of the sound. So when we're talking about instruction in graphemes, we talk about using very explicit language and being very clear. And we always also like to use visual aids. So if I'm introducing children to the SH digraph, I might start with connecting it to something they already know. And so I could say a consonant digraph is when 2 consonants come together to make 1 sound. You've already learned about a consonant digraph. We've talked about CK. When C and K are together at the end of a word, they make 1 sound. The 2 consonants, S and H, have their own sounds, S and H. But when these consonants come together in a word, they make 1 new sound, sh, like at the beginning of the word sheep. The consonant digraph SH can come at the beginning of a word, such as ship or shop. It can also come at the end of a word, such as fish or wish. So this introduction helps kids understand what that grapheme is and what the grapheme is not. Once kids have built their basic accuracy with connecting this grapheme and the phoneme, then I want to build automaticity. So I can use a visual drill where I might have cards or slides where I am showing kids the grapheme and asking them to name the letter and tell me the sound or sounds that they have learned to associate with that letter. The goal here is to develop automaticity. I can say CK is K, Y is Y, E is E, P is P, F is F, and so on. When we're doing a visual drill, we're displaying the grapheme and ask children to say the letter name and then the sound that spells that particular letter. When children have learned additional phonemes associated with the grapheme, we might get to the C, and they can say C spells K and C spells S once they've learned more than one way to read that. When we're building automaticity with GPCs, we can also do it in the opposite direction. So in this case, the teacher would be presenting the sound and asking kids how to spell that sound. So if I say ah, you can say ah is a, and building that automaticity and writing and learning the formation, building the automaticity with letter formation as well. So in an auditory drill, students write the grapheme. So the teacher saying a sound and having the students form the grapheme while saying the sound. So if I say D, all my students would say D is D, and they write the letter D. For both of these drills, one of the things that we want to make sure that we're doing is always making our sounds blendable. So you noticed when I said the sound for D, I didn't say duh, I said D. It's a very important element of making these connections. We want kids to connect the grapheme with a blendable phoneme. We can also help kids understand the articulatory gesture that's associated with it. So for example, if you are working on the grapheme TH and students are confusing it with F, that's a really common confusion. So they might say, I took a bath, right? And paying attention to what your mouth is doing while you're producing that phoneme is one way to help make that clearer, and also to do a better job of connecting that grapheme with the phoneme. So I know when I'm spelling bath that I'm not going to end it with an F, I'm going to end it with a TH. So as we're moving down the road, our next stop is at words. And again, as soon as we're learning a few grapheme phoneme correspondences, we're diving right into words. So a little bit about word reading development. The person who's probably taught us the most about how children learn to read words is Linnea Airey. And she developed a way of thinking about word recognition development that is a phase theory. And so she's very particular about talking about it in terms of phases instead of stages, because the idea here is that phases overlap, and you can really be straddling and be in more than one phase at the same time, whereas a stage sort of ends and then you're in the next stage. So that's an important thing to understand as I go through these phases. So the first phase in Airey's theory is the pre-alphabetic phase. And this is where children see things in their environment and they recognize them and associate words with them. So you're driving down the road and your 2-year-old sees McDonald's and they say, can we, ask, can we go to McDonald's, right? And mommy is, oh my goodness, he can read, right? Well, no, he's not reading. He's recognizing a logo and associating it with a word. And that's a very common early literacy element that children are able to do, associate meaning with symbols in their environment. And it is an important first phase, and all children go through this. But we know when they see that Coke logo, they're not reading the word Coca-Cola. They know that that's a thing that they like, right? And so they're using the symbol or the logo or the picture or some other irrelevant visual cue, but they're not attending to letters. It's before they start attending to letters. It's pre-alphabetic. The next phase is the partial alphabetic phase. And this is when kids are first learning the letters and they start to associate those letters with specific words. So maybe you read a book to your child where there was a word that started with P, and in that book, that word was puppy. And then the next day they see another word that starts with P and they say, oh, that word's puppy. And it's not, it's popcorn in this case. So the idea here is that kids will attend to usually the initial letter in a word, and they'll overgeneralize. Once they've learned a word that they associate with that letter, then it becomes the word they associate with that letter. So in this phase, children are becoming aware that letters have something to do with reading, but they're not really sure how to piece it all together. A little bit further in the development, though, they move into what we call the full alphabetic phase. And in the full alphabetic phase, they're able to look at all the letters in a word and blend those sounds together to generate the actual full word. So they can say at cat, where they're really attending letter by letter within the word. this is skill decoding, right? This is decoding accuracy. It doesn't really lend itself to automaticity, though, when you have to really focus on every letter. But you need to move through this phase before you can get to the next phase, which is the consolidated alphabetic phase. In the consolidated alphabetic phase, children notice chunks within words. So they might look at the word splash and say splash rather than saying ash, right? They're starting to notice the chunks within a word. These are patterns of letters that they've seen before, and they're starting to recognize and map these connections. And this happens after that letter by letter decoding. So there are some programs that teach kids to start to recognize word families, but look at letter by letter, and that really goes against the research, and it really tells us effective progress is. The last of I'm going to
Oh, she's resetting to come back on.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
Are there any questions so far? All right.
Not a question, just a show of appreciation that so far in what Dr. Lane is presenting, it would be impossible to put the entire science of reading into 45 minutes for our audience, but as she's progressing through these through each section, it is very, very understandable how reading is being built, especially for this group where, you know, a lot of folks are dealing with that early literacy, that pre-literacy idea. This is very easy to understand and to articulate to others. So thank you so much for what we have so far.
Thanks for the feedback. Here's Holly.
And my apologies. I'm not sure why I got kicked off, but there you go. Whenever that comes up and it says your internet is unstable, I take it personally, and I think Zoom is telling me that I'm unstable, and so I don't really want to go there. All right. So I'm not sure where I got kicked off exactly, but hopefully
This is
Did you-
exactly it. It was right with the
what was it?
automatic.
It was on here? Okay.
Mhm. So you're right in that.
you.
got it right.
Thank you, thank you. Okay. All right. So I'm going to show you some text that comes up on the screen, and I want you to just see if you
It's happening again. I'm going to tell her to come in my office.
While we have a pause for a minute while we're getting this set up, if anyone has questions that they want to put in the chat as well, we can also answer questions in that way.
We're back together.
Perfect.
I'm just gonna sit here in Valentina's office instead. So let
That
her get,
absolutely works. That's no problem.
oh, sorry. I don't know what's happening there. Okay. So Okay. Try again. Okay, so hopefully it won't kick us both off here. But did it show up when I shared? Okay, I'm going to try one more time. And I want you to read as the words come up. Okay, were you able to read and finish about the same time that the words finished? That's because you're in the automatic phase. So congratulations, you're a proficient adult reader. But the idea here is that moving through these phases is how children or humans learn to read and spell words. And so Aries' work has really informed a lot of the work that we do in terms of helping us become better at teaching children these skills. So the skills that we're attempting to teach here in early literacy are decoding and encoding. So decoding we can think of as translating print into speech. This requires the capacity to blend phonemes together. So to decode a word is to read a word, and that's to blend the sounds in that word together and get the word. Encoding is the opposite process. That's translating speech into print. This requires the capacity to segment phonemes. So saying a word cat and then saying each sound and then representing each of the sounds with a grapheme. All of this leads to a process that we call orthographic mapping, or I should say that Linnea Airy calls orthographic mapping. She's the person who coined that term to show what that process of moving through those phases results in. So the idea is to get kids to the point in your instruction so that they are able to orthographically map words. We talk about this in terms of making those connections between the phonemes and graphemes in a particular sequence in order to secure the spellings, the pronunciations, and the meanings of words into your memory. So bonding that sequence of letters into your memory with the pronunciation and meaning. This is what leads to the capacity to instantly read and recognize and retrieve words. So that's what you all were doing when you were reading that Goldilocks, was you were looking at words that you already knew because you have seen those words before, you've orthographically mapped those sequences. So in a word like frog, if I wanted to spell that word, I would start with the spoken word and say, okay, frog, how do I spell that? And I would think about the sounds, frog, and then I would recognize, okay, is an F, R is an R, and so on until I had the word spelled. If I'm reading that word, I'm doing the opposite process. I'm starting with the written word and I'm thinking, okay, F, that represents R, represents R, and so on until I have all of the sounds that I can blend together and get the word. And doing this should be instant once you have had enough exposures to a particular word or a particular sequence of grapheme phoneme correspondences. And that is the idea of what we're trying to accomplish. So this process works even when there's not a one-to-one correspondence. So in the word fish, the sh is represented by 2 letters, as opposed to frog, there were 4 phonemes and 4 letters. That grapheme phoneme correspondence that we talked about, in this case, we've got 3 phonemes and 4 letters, but still 3 graphemes. It also works with irregular words. So even when you have a word that has an irregular or unexpected grapheme phoneme correspondence, you can use some of the same knowledge and same processing to arrive at the word. A technique that has kind of fallen out of favor because it's not effective is memorizing an irregular word as a visual unit. We don't do that because we know that for an irregular word like said, the S and the D represent exactly the phonemes we would expect. It's really just that AI representing the phoneme eh that's unusual. And so if I'm spelling that word, I have to remember that eh is spelled AI. If I'm reading it, I need to remember that AI spells eh in this particular word. That is a much more effective way of getting kids to learn to read those irregular words. So now I'm going to turn it over to Valentina. My computer doesn't have to work for this part, just hers does. And she can talk a little bit about some of the methods that we use for teaching decoding and encoding.
Thanks, Holly. Usually she's not next to me when I say that. Thanks, Holly. As Holly mentioned, we are going to now connect a lot of what Holly has talked about related to Linnea's areas of word reading development into hopefully practices that some of you may be able to use in your settings or support your teacher candidates with. So the first is probably familiar to you. We're going to talk about Old Conan boxes, and D.B. Old Conan described in the 60s a method for teaching children how to segment the sounds or phonemes in word, first by moving markers into squares. So when we look at this with these examples that you see on the screen, this would look like the word is key. So we would move markers for each phoneme or sound in the word key. And you can say the sounds as we move them together. Ready? And then for cat, at, and you get the idea. Og. And so the markers are representing these individual phonemes or sounds within each box. This method has been shown to be very effective for supporting students' phonemic awareness because they are moving again a concrete object into each square, representing each individual sound. In particular, this method supports phonemic segmentation that Holly had talked about. So being able to hear or separate all the individual phonemes or sounds in a word, which is a really important literacy skill for being able to encode or spell words. Because when students spell words, they have to hear the whole word, hear each individual phoneme or sound to then represent it with the letter or letter combinations that make those sounds. More recently, researchers have added letters to this method. So if we were still looking at our three pictures here, it would look like this. So again, with either letters or letters combinations, but it is a one-to-one correspondence there. So including letters improves now students' understanding of the alphabetic principle, along with supporting phonemic awareness. And it provides students opportunities to practice decoding skills as they are incorporating letters. And it's a method that also promotes orthographic mapping. So when looking at an example, if we had the word fish, when we think about the steps that a teacher might take to use Old Conan boxes to support students' phonemic awareness and alphabetic principle, we would first count the sounds in the word with the child. So you can do this along with us if you want. So if you said the word fish, we would say the sounds. You could see that we're using our fingers and saying sounds to help students hear them separated or segmented. Now we're going to draw one box for each sound. We're also going to say the sounds again as we draw those boxes. So, this provided the students another opportunity to hear the sounds clearly segmented or separated, and they got to see as we drew one box per sound. At first, we might use chips or markers to move, just like Old Conan's original method. So, and that would be appropriate if students hadn't been exposed to those letters or graphemes yet, right? But as soon as students have learned letter combinations, as Holly pointed out with the road visual, we want to incorporate letters. So we can also say the sounds again as we move the chips outside. So we would insert letters by helping students hear each individual sound and connect it to the letters. So what's the first sound we hear in fish? Good, let's add that letter. That's an F. What's the next sound we hear? Good, what letter makes that sound, Holly?
I.
Good job, let's write it in. And what's the last sound we hear?
Shh.
Good, and what two letters did we talk about make that sound?
SH.
What a benefit of having you in here. Thanks, Holly. And of course, if students haven't learned that grapheme yet, as a teacher, maybe in preschool, I would say the two letters that make that sound are SH, right? So that could be a scaffold provided if there maybe were some letter combinations that students hadn't explicitly learned yet. Another important part is writing the whole word under the boxes. So students don't think about these words as words that are box words, right? So as we write the whole word under the boxes, we would also want to say the sounds again, ish. And most importantly, we want students to read the word at the end, fish. Of course, the level of scaffolding that is supported using the strategy would depend on the age and the literacy skills of that group of students. But hopefully that provided a good illustration. You saw an example that had a grapheme phoneme correspondence of SH, so more complex. Of course, this can be done with CVC words like the word dig, other words with more complex graphemes like vowel teams and the word male, and even multisyllabic words for students that may be receiving intervention, maybe students with learning disabilities in later grades. Another strategy we wanted to share or talk about today is this idea of using manipulative letters to support encoding and decoding. So in math, it's very common to use manipulatives to make abstract concepts more concrete. So in reading or literacy, we can use manipulative letters to make, again, that abstract concept of phoneme blending or putting sounds together and phoneme segmentation or separating sounds more concrete. So word work is something that can be done with any kind of manipulative letter, including magnetic letters, letter cards, letter tiles, and such. It's really important that, especially working with younger learners in that pre-alphabetic phase, that we focus on using letters of just one color, so that students, as they're using the letters to practice encoding and decoding, are only focusing on the most important part of the letter. The letter's identity is the shape, not that it's a red vowel and a blue consonant. We don't want them to attend to color or other irrelevant visual cues. So here's some examples of manipulative letters or magnetic letters and tiles that would work to do word work with. We also linked on your handout our digital manipulative letters or word work mats that we have available on our website. These would be really appropriate even with younger learners on the screen so that they can see the teacher, again, supporting this encoding and decoding with letter combinations that students have explicitly learned. You can see here lots of other examples of this idea of using manipulative letters, including larger foam letters, again, more appropriate for younger learners who may be practicing their application of the letters and sounds that they've learned to read and spell words. So here's a virtual model of what word work with manipulative letters would look like. So as you can see, this student would just have the letters that are being used or some of the letters being used for this activity instead of having the whole alphabet perhaps. And so we would begin with the word sip. So the teacher would guide the students in writing this first word sip and maybe having them read it. Sip, sip. Now I might say change sip to lip. So my student or students would change the S to an L. And they've spelled the new word lip. Now I might say, okay, change the letter that says, oh, actually, instead of that, we're gonna add an F in front. And together we're gonna read this new word. And the teacher, again, in younger grades, very guided practice reading. Let's say the sounds together, ready? Flip. Great job. And if students make errors, providing some corrective feedback and additional support. So you get the idea. We're alternating as much as we can between students getting practice reading and spelling words, but having the manipulative letters is helping them really apply this knowledge of letters and sounds and get practice with both reading and spelling. So when using manipulative letters, a really helpful tool for teachers or practitioners is to have a word chain of carefully chosen words to make sure our instruction is really targeted. That can be used for students to practice encoding and decoding. So here's an example of one. Again, pretty simple CVC words. This word chain in particular adds S at the end. But something that you'll notice is that within the word chain, only one part of the word changes at a time, either that initial, medial, or final letter or letter combination. And so that's really important, especially with younger learners or beginning readers that are practicing encoding and decoding. Word chains can be done at varying levels of difficulty. Of course, with beginning readers, we would use simpler words like the example you saw previously and this one on the screen. But it could be more and in this example in particular, it's only the onset that is changing. So you can see that the ADs, or sorry, only. Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
only the onset that's changing, the AD is staying the same. And so this is a little bit simpler word chain even than the one we saw in the previous slide, because students are only changing and attending to that initial placement. In this other word chain, you can see changes in either in the initial, medial, or final position. So this would require students to have some more phonemic awareness to apply again in encoding and decoding. And this chain includes even more complex graphemes outside of just the alphabet letters, but this is to illustrate that this is a strategy and a tool that can be used again for students that are learning more complex graphemes, maybe are practicing encoding and decoding in intervention settings. So when you think about encoding, to give students encoding or spelling practice, it depends on what us as the teacher or interventionist is saying to the students to do. So if they are using their letters and we say change sat to hat, that means they have sat in front of them. They have to hear the difference in that initial placement, change the S to an H to encode or spell the new word. And so because of the direction or prompt that we provided as a teacher, the student got to practice encoding. And you see two other examples there of types of prompts we would provide for encoding practice. For decoding or reading practice, this is where we're telling them what letter to change, and the goal is for them to read or decode this new word. So if they had the word sat again, and we said change the S in sat to an H, the student did that, and then we say, once they have the new word, we say, what word do you have? And the student now reads. So because of the direction we provided the student, once again, they're practicing now decoding. We can also do this when students have learned to associate the sounds. We can say change the S in sat to a instead of using letter names. Once the students have connected that, they take away the S and replace it with an H, and we say read your new word. They are practicing now reading the new word or decoding the new word. Here's another illustration of this just really quickly, just so that you can see the benefit of alternating between the prompts that we use when using word change, so that students get practice with both encoding and decoding. So we might say make the word bit, and because they are making the word, they are practicing spelling or encoding of that word. If we say now change the I to a U, what word is this? They've done that. They've changed the I to the U. And so they are practice reading or decoding the word. If we say change but to bug, this again has the students make, they have to hear the difference in that final position and practice spelling or encoding that new word. And if we say now change the U to an I again, or sorry, that's a wrong, we're gonna keep going. All right. We wanted to draw your attention to, on our website, we have home practice sheets for different alphabet letters, and they do have mini word chains, which are really handy when talking about use of word chains for encoding and decoding practice. We also do have a webinar that talks all about word chains and encoding and decoding practice, much more than we're able to get to today. So we are going to come back to the road now to talk a little bit about text and how text is really important to incorporate in our instruction, even if it's, again, through heavy scaffolds when students are younger in preschool settings and kindergarten. So it's really important for students to get practice in context, because it conveys the why to all these other skills that they're practicing more in isolation. It brings it all together. It also helps build independence with the application of skills, first with support, but then eventually later in their reading development without as much support. We're showing them how to use strategies. We're applying it in text so that they can later do it independently. And text does offer context for reading. And so we don't want students to rely on context and pictures to read, but it is helpful when we are learning to read or when we're trying to interpret text to have the context for unfamiliar words. So there are two types of texts that get talked about in early reading, and that would be leveled books and decodable books. Again, we're a little bit running out of time, but it is important to think about these two types of texts and how they can be used, again, in settings, instructional settings, intervention settings to support student application of skills within text. Leveled books are controlled based on word count, picture support, and predictability, versus decodable texts are really based on the decodability of the words. So this would depend on a scope and sequence and what words are decodable for students based on concepts that they've learned in that scope and sequence. And the real benefit of decodable text is that they allow students to apply those graphing correspondences that they've been learning. Again, that application component. So really quick, just to make a point, a lot of times people say that decodable texts aren't very interesting just because they have to be so controlled based on a scope and sequence. So as you can see here in these two illustrations, the second decodable book, or the second book we see here, which is a decodable book, is a pretty fun book to read, even though it's really controlled by the graphing phoning correspondences that the students have learned. Also, that kind of text ensures that students are using their knowledge of graphing phoning correspondences that they've been explicitly taught. The text we see up above, it's very unlikely that a beginning reader could read the word elephant or giraffe, right? And so this would mean that students are relying on pictures and the pattern in the sentences to read this book. And so again, when choosing text, we do want to make sure that a big focus of this is students' application of skills that they are learning, and to use different kinds of texts. We did mention a scope and sequence. This is linked on the U5 Foundation's toolbox link on your handout as well. This is just one example of a scope and sequence that goes from simple to more complex concepts. And many of you will have lots of interest, we think, in the resources within the alphabet section of our scope and sequence. So here's an example of a decodable text in an early lesson in that scope and sequence. So this is lesson 8. As you can see, they've not learned many graphing phoning correspondences yet, but they're still able to apply those graphing phoning correspondences and reading words within text. As we can see with this very thrilling story of I sit, I tap. Also, the resources on the toolbox do have these texts broken up into smaller sections on slides that could be used for instruction as well. If you are working with students who are receiving intervention in older grades, there are more complex decodable texts that again help give students lots of practice applying concepts that they're learning throughout the scope and sequence as they move into more complex texts. And on the toolbox, the last resource we'll share is a decodable text guide, which includes text beyond this first column, which are the U5 Foundation's texts, and points you to other texts that align with concepts on the scope and sequence, including the alphabet. All right, so I will let Holly wrap it up quite quickly.
Well, thanks. This is basically the idea here is we want to help kids, support kids as they move down this road and become more proficient. And so hopefully the resources that we provided, the toolbox, and then the handout with other resources will give you some a starting place to go and find things that can support as you are working with kids developing their foundational skills.
And we will put the link to the handout again if you joined a little bit after our initial start and weren't able to get that.
And also, I do want to remind our guests, we have right before Valentina posted that, we do have a survey. So make sure you hit that link before you click out of our Zoom today, just so you can make sure, give us all the great feedback on this presentation. I want to thank you, ladies. This has so much implication for like the work that I do in assistive technology and working with the preschoolers, and I can see how that meshes so well. So there may be some other questions. I know it's going past 1 o'clock, but if anybody would like to raise their hand, if you are able to stay on, we do want to make sure you get your questions answered.
Yes, we just want to thank you guys so much for coming in and presenting that, this is so great, especially for the information that really helps us across different disciplines. I know we saw some things in the chat of kind of, like, yes, these are things of how it applies for a speech pathologist. So it's helpful to see kind of how we bring something to think about within the education world and how do we sort of go across different disciplines of how to help kids. So really appreciate it.
Well, I know when I first met Valentina and Holly, I was blown away by their spirit of collaboration. So while I'm a hurricane at heart, I am heartened to know that
And I'm a Gator, so go Gators.
in the state of Florida, we've got some great stuff going on, and we do rely on each other for expertise. And so, we have orange in common, so we'll keep it.